Welcome to the third day of the 10th Annual SISE Conference. Hello, everybody. Hello, all the fellows. Hello to the audience. My name is Eric Vettel, and I'm the president of the American Energy Society, co-hosting this conference with SISE with the University of Illinois, Chicago. I prepared a formal introduction of our next speaker, but then the moment we announced that Dr. M.K. Dorsey was going to speak, questions started pouring in. So I'm just going to hit some of the highlights here. Dr. Dorsey is a limited partner of Iverson Solar in Iverson, Africa. He's director of the Michigan Environmental Council. He is member of the Club of Rome, co-founder of the Sunrise Movement, so on and so on. The reason why I'm going to skip my formal introduction, obviously, is because people already know. And some of the questions that poured in, I'm going to read one, Dr. Dorsey, because I think it's a good way to launch into this. It's really not a question, but it's sort of going to be provocative in terms of stirring some things up. This is one of the questions. It comes in, and I'm going to paraphrase. I work for a financial institution that shall remain nameless. We are a large global bank and an insurance group. To be sure, we operate at the edge of capitalism where regulations like Sarbanes-Oxley gets murky. Privately, we are shifting strategy from sequestration to adaptation. In other words, we are assuming that climate change is happening now and humanity won't change. So we are focusing on resiliency. Some regions will win and others will lose. We have analysts deciding which regions will get hit the hardest by climate change and which to protect with capital and insurance coverage. I'll just paraphrase again for everyone. Some will win and some will lose, and people won't change. I read this because, Dr. Dorsey, you attract these sort of ideas. You draw them in, and you have something profound, always profound to say. I am so thrilled on behalf of George, Thomas, Katie, and all the fellows. Thank you, thank you, thank you. It's an honor and pleasure, Dr. Dorsey.
Truly my pleasure. Thank you all for having me. I want to take a few minutes, and I think what I'll do is, I'll answer that particular question not directly now, but some answers will come out in the course of our discussion. And I hope everyone can see the slides and everything, and I hope the audio is clear. I too wear a great number of hats. So it's not surprising that somebody is, like the questionnaire, the questioner is, from a capital group and with insurance and worried about these issues. I certainly, on our investments, we were involved in a great number of investments you can see in the slide, particularly on the PV development side. But also, at the bottom of the commodity chain, as it were, POUTICALS Solar is a panel manufacturer, and they do some what we call original equipment manufacturer with some of the tier one producers in India. We also work with folks certainly in the U.S. Hawks & Associates is a Midwest firm that primarily work on energy efficiency. It's an engineering firm. But at the same time, I've, spent a lot of my life in the nonprofit world and committed to social justice, political change, because I think we have to have the capacity to, as the old adage is, walk and chew gum at the same time. And so some of that is embodied in the work that we put into co-creating Sunrise with folks at Wesleyan initially, and it's grown well beyond that, as many of you all know. And it's also working with folks, my fellow members at the Club of Rome and many other organizations. I say all that to give you a sort of a sense of where I'm coming from to some of these problems. But today I'm going to be speaking absolutely individually. But it's that broad hat that I have that I think is a way of animating all of us, and certainly it animates me into how I approach tackling things like climate injustice, energy injustice, and delivering the solutions that I think are relevant. And that's where I want to focus our attention today, on three key problems as I see them that I think will give us some context. I know the previous speakers from the other days have touched on some of these things. And I want to then focus our attention on what I think are the dominant solutions to those problems. And then I want to close by making just a handful of requests of all of you. And I think those things will speak certainly to that first big question, and then no doubt speak to some of the other questions that I've gotten. So what are the problems? Nothing surprising here. I call this the big problem. It's not really the biggest problem in my mind. It's the problem of the unfolding climate crisis. We could have a whole presentation just on this particular problem. All of you who are fellows, know this problem well. Nothing surprising in this slide. The red bar is the anthropogenic forcings. The blue is what we see naturally. And we know that basically, no matter where you look, what continent, what part of the world, the trend is up, and it's up at a particularly rapid clip. Nothing new is surprising there. I think the next big problem, or the bigger problem, is the one of energy injustice. And this slide does not by any means capture it all. This is simply looking at on a particular kind of supply, and the nuclear fuel supply, what communities are proximate to digging up of the fuel source for nuclear. And we see that it's disproportionately biased to Native American communities, in particular in the US. So the energy injustice problem encompasses many, many things. It encompasses not only the problem like this that we see where dirty fuels and dirty production are closer and disproportionately located to poorer, more marginalized communities. You can think of energy injustice also from the vantage of, we know we've got great data. My colleagues like Tony Reams at the University of Michigan, and a great number of others, Dan Kamen at Berkeley, looking at the data of how those that are poor, those that have fewer resources, commit and spend a disproportionate amount of their earnings to keep the lights on. Another form of energy injustice. That's, I think, a slightly bigger problem than the climate problem. But I would say perhaps the biggest problem is maybe the nexus of the two, and I call that the problem of climate injustice. Again, the slide is just one sort of representation of the problem. We see the crisis of who's harmed and who's affected in terms of individuals worsening over the decades, particularly as we come into the end of the 20th century and worsening as we come now into the 21st century. Nothing really surprising here. We see the problem concentrated in the developing world, in the emerging markets, as it were, which speaks to the questioner that some people are absolutely going to be losers and are already losing, and losing in a disproportionately more aggressive way. But that isn't something that's off in emerging markets. It's something that's certainly in the developed world, as it were, in the U.S. This is a problem. The problem of climate injustice has been on the radar of researchers for quite some time. This is colleagues of mine, Rachel Morello-Frosch, again at Berkeley, and others, Manuel Pastor, looking at the problem domestically in the U.S. And looking at the way in which the unfolding climate problem impacts disproportionately those on the margins of American society, particularly the poor, particularly those folks of color, minority populations, and so forth. And what's really important about Rachel and company's work here is that they started this stuff over a decade ago. So this is a decades-old report. They followed up actually with a new one that came out just last year. So this is a problem that's by no means new, but it's those three sort of crises that I think we have to keep front and center as we think about dealing with climate change, dealing with energy injustice, as it were. And it's worth sort of looking a little bit under the hood a wee bit, because what does it mean and to think about climate injustice? It means that we're going to see a whole host of other associated problems get worse because of the unfolding climate crisis, whether that's malaria, whether that's dengue fever, whether that's other kinds of diseases. We see those things worsening as we go into the future of this century. They get worse in 2030 with the blue bars there, as well as towards 2050 with the orange bars. And if you look at those bars with either of the boxes there, whether it's undernutrition in the upper left, or whether it's malaria, whether it's diarrhea disease or dengue, you see that there's a particular concentration again in the global south, as it were. So, and you know, the high country exception is, of course, heat mortality, where we see again disproportionate impacts in the south, but also impacts in the in the developed world, as it were. So it's that backdrop I want to give you all to. I think we have to keep that in mind as we think about the solutions to these problems. We have to be fully aware that climate change isn't unfolding evenly around the world, that even the responses to it don't come about evenly. Certain people have more resources to access things, some of the solution set. Some people are going to be harmed as we build out responses to this unfolding problem, and that's the sort of the essence of that question. You could have had no better an opening question than somebody in the sort of finance world who's already planning what I'm telling you. There are individuals that are already deciding. Well, some people are going to have to suck it and be harmed by this problem. And some people, well, we may put investments elsewhere that may not push resources to them. That I would offer to you is something we can prevent. And that'll be my answer, my brief answer, direct or indirect to that opening question. I don't think that we're going to have a world, and we don't have a world, where people aren't doing anything, where people aren't responding. I think we live in a world where there's tremendous opportunities and tremendous surprises and stochastic events that are as potentially fit for scale and purpose as those threats of the climate crisis, the energy injustice crisis, and the bigger problem of climate injustice. And we can have a discussion about that at the end. Now, what are those solutions? Two brief solutions. And of course, both of these are close to my heart and my work and my mission, as it were. One, I think, is the money and technological side. We're now in an era, and that's at the 2000 on the far right of the slide. 2018, and really, even into 19, and going forward, where the renewable solution set is cheaper, more profitable. I'll say obviously cleaner, has less deleterious effects on public health than the old 20th century technologies, which, as I love to tell people and remind people, basically, coal, even gas, certainly nukes. These technologies of the 20th century have got, one foot in the graveyard and another one on the banana peel, as it were, in terms of both their profitability, in terms of what they can do to check the solution and solve the unfolding crisis that we talked about at the beginning. Nothing really new here. The good thing about this slide, other than the trend that you see, is that the trend is continuing to be favorable for renewables and not favorable for fossil fuels. That's something to keep in mind as we go forward. If you dial down, you can see that, basically that point remade for on the left for wind and then on the right for solar. Nothing really surprising there. This is all, I think, data that all, fellows like yourselves know really well, have looked at this. A lot of this is from Lazard, it's from other banks and so forth. Nothing surprising here. It does animate what we do. It animates some of our business. It animates why we've been focusing a lot in emerging markets, particularly in Africa. It animates why we created EBIS on Africa to really deliver and lead on the build out of commercial industrial scale solar in Africa in particular. But it also animates why we've been working in India, in South America, also elsewhere in Asia, and increasingly in the US and North America. Nothing really surprising. I think the other solution that we've got to think about is the political and movement-based solution. I believe, and these are, somewhat separate from my business, but they're never separate in my head, that it's really the pressure from political movements. It's the demands that civil society is going to continue to make, both on elected officials, but also on, I'll call them, wayward firms and wayward banks, even if they dare to remain nameless. That pressure is going to be there from civil society. It's there in organizations like Sunrise. It's there in other organizations. The list's way too long to name. I'll offer, though, that a thought that some may not know. We created Sunrise not just because we could keep up that pressure and we knew that was the right thing to do, but because we witnessed and saw in great detail that the previous administration, not this current lackluster one, but the previous one also wasn't delivering solutions that were at scale and fit for purpose of scale. So that was part of the animation. So let's be clear about that. Some people don't know that history, but that was really the true motivation to begin the process that now is given us Sunrise. So I think it's also important to recognize that just like on the money and tech side, the approaches are global. We've got renewable coming online much faster in certain markets than others, much faster in other markets that don't include places like the United States. I mean, the US is arguably a laggard in its deployment of renewable energy at scale. It's trying to play a catch-up game, but there are a lot of factors that have been slowing that down. Correspondingly, we've got local to global social movements. I used to sit on the board of the Sierra Club, and it was really that awareness of working globally as well as locally that got us, almost now 2 decades ago, imagine, to turn on the Beyond Coal campaign. When we turned that campaign on, most funders, a lot of the private foundations, you name any of them, Hewlett, Packard, you can go on down the line. They said, "Are you guys crazy? Why would you think that you're going to be able to stop the coal industry?" We, of course, ignored that kind of admonishment and carried on with it. And the result has been a program that's been working in concert with communities around the US, but also globally, to really begin to shut down the coal industry. And I think it's been quite successful. So that tees me up to think about 3 kinds of miniature requests of you, given that context, the context of the crisis, as well as the context of some of the solutions. I want to urge all of you all to think about how you're going to keep yourselves in what I like to think of as good trouble. What do I mean by good trouble? I think you really got to get in the mode of keeping up pressure on those that are slowing down the solutions and also driving some of the problem. Many of you may remember it made some of the Nightline news when we did it. We brought the protest to Senator Feinstein's office, several months back. I thought it was interesting because she said, well, you all don't know a lot. Speaking to some of the Sunrise activists and others, I've been working on this problem for decades. And for me, that underscored the problem. A sitting senator reminding people that were trying to keep her accountable and keep the heat on her, that she had been working on the problem and she characterized it for decades. The reality of that was that she'd been a failure for decades. And we need to be able to articulate that, and also not just articulate the shortcomings of elected officials, but also begin to put forward the solutions. And that's really what we've been trying to do. And that speaks to the second point of keeping both heat in the streets and in the suites. I think it's possible to do that in more ways than one. We can talk about the details of how that's done. That certainly means that on some level, social movement protests, taking over elected officials' offices, as it were, absolutely has a role. protests in the streets, civil disobedience, nonviolent civil disobedience actually absolutely has a role. But we also have to translate that kind of street heat, those large-scale protests, into delivering solutions in what I call in the suites, in places like the questioner's bank, in their insurance firm, at the table with partners. And I think that that's more possible now than it ever has been, because at least for the solution set that we talked about, go back to just the money and tech side, the numbers are grossly in our favor. So if there's any time where we can push on the solution, now is the time to do that. And I think that that tees up the last bit. We've got to approach these solutions, these responses, at the social movement level, at the political level, at the level of the boardroom, with a sense of urgency. And why do we have to do it with a sense of urgency? I think we've got to do it with a sense of urgency because we believe the science. You can't have it both ways. You can't say, well, yeah, we accept the climate science, and say you're going to accept I'll say, how could I best characterize him? The most coherent American candidate for the presidency. You're not allowed to accept his speech from just last night, telling us that we're going to roll out a plan to 2050. 2050 is no longer enough. That's too short. If we stick with 2050, if you really know the science, you know that Kyoto teed up that target as a 50-50 chance, a coin toss chance of staying under the 1.5 degree, threshold. That's not enough. That kind of target from literally a generation ago when it was set down, generation ago, we know now isn't enough. And if we know that with today's science, and we see the solution set on the financial side and on the money side coming strongly in our favor, we've got to push harder and faster and make demands on both the wayward candidate and the more coherent candidate. And I'll leave you all to figure out who's who. Perhaps you already know. And so it's those three things that I just want to stress with you. And that's where I'll close.
Dr. Dorsey, that is fantastic. Just so you and the fellows know, we started out Monday with data. We wanted people to understand, and I'd love to eventually have you comment on, it's not a gigaton problem, it's a teraton problem, et cetera. But there was about data. Then day two was about letting the fellows in the audience see the inner workings, see people from the industry, from utilities, and how they think. And now today is, now what are you going to do about it, right? And so this was fantastic. Questions? We have questions. Giselle has a question. I'm going to piggyback on it just so that it weaves into what you just said. Sure. Giselle asks, what do you think is missing from current conversations surrounding sustainability and energy? What do people need to give more focus towards? And I'd like to also add, you had mentioned political activism and speaking out, I think you called it good trouble, but there's also an incentive. You said that the money is grossly out of balance. Does the message also include incentives to do the right thing? Do you know what I mean? Is there an intersection of the political and the financial? Giselle asked, but I do want to make sure, Giselle's, what's missing?
So I think we will, even when you have disproportionately large profit potential with renewables, which is absolutely the case in many, many markets, including here in the US for that matter. You have returns, above 10, 12, 15% in many markets here in the US. You have some returns, north of 17, 18, approaching venture grade returns. Even when you have that, and that is a bona fide reality in both developed and emerging markets, and they can be even more profitable in emerging markets. We've got projects in some markets in Africa looking at north of 25, approaching 30% IRR. So even with that, you still have to deal with slow walking utilities. You still have to deal with regulators who are no disrespect to peers of my father, that are living in a 20th century mentality. So there is nothing that I think displaces the need for increasing urgency. And I would say that is too often missing in some of these conversations. And I think those of us who've got the data, those of us who've got the science, those of us who are sitting in offices where you've got, as your opening questioner said, a whole separate team of analysts. It's a kind of form of bankruptcy, no pun intended, if he's in a bank, to have a whole separate team of analysts that aren't giving you the cutting edge information. So we've got to keep the pressure on folks, because there is an unfortunate tendency for some, not all, for some to walk too slow, to be too laggard. And we've got to keep that pressure on them. Absolutely.
George, I know you have some questions in the pipeline. Should we let Chris, you had a question that kind of shifted. Does Chris want to ask it, or Chris, do you want me to? I know you submitted it.
I'm cool to ask it. But my question, just because I'm curious, is I'm the hub coordinator for Sunrise Chicago here. And I was just wondering, what was your personal contribution to the Sunrise movement and how you helped get it to where it is now today?
Blood, sweat, and tears, Chris. And this is the, I call, there's I'm trained as an anthropologist, for those who may have found that out or not, but there's a wing of anthropology that it's called the study of boring things, people looking at telephone books and other things and understanding, how society works through the sort of the mundane aspects of it. So a lot of what I did was very mundane, getting us office space. Basically, at the time I was sitting on the board of the Sierra Club, and I said, hey, look, we got a handful of people. We have this big giant building in DC with all these floors that are empty. Well, I don't want to pay. I want some corner space, because we got all these floors that are empty. We moved from a small house near behind Capitol Hill to this, we had 4 floors in a building, of which when we first moved there, most of these floors are empty. So doing very basic things, and I think that kind of contribution, if you're sitting in a bank or if you're sitting on a board, one shouldn't underestimate the quotidian. It's as important as the iconic as you were. And a great amount of things, a great number of things, it's really just the day-to-day grind, going out and writing infinite proposals and calling and pestering, keeping the heat, as it were, in the boardrooms of foundations, trying to get the $10,000 and the $20,000. Most people think that Sunrise must have millions of dollars. They convince all those candidates, all those Democratic candidates to adopt a position or at least speak on the Green New Deal. No, we don't have that. We have sweat equity. We have grind. We have toil. And that's how you get things done. There's no sort of magic wand. There's no tricks. There's work. And if you're not really committed to do that, well, then step aside, because a lot of other people are.
Agreed. Thank you.
George, do you want to? I think you've got a number of questions.
Yeah, thank you, Eric. And actually, Erica, I know you had a question. Would you like to ask her question about pivotal moments in MK's life?
Sure. Thank you, George. And thank you, Dr. Dorsey, for joining us virtually today. My question is, do you recall any pivotal moments in your earlier life that greatly influenced your passions for sustainability and climate justice today?
One stands out, and it was a bit depressing, to be perfectly honest. It was a while ago. It was in the 90s. I was a undergrad at University of Michigan, and we got a leak of a report. The former Senator Waxman, Henry Waxman of California, got some memos from the Environmental Protection Agency. And at the time, several of us were involved in trying to push the Environmental Protection Agency to create an office on environmental justice, which they now have. They didn't have this in the mid to late 90s. And the memo was revelatory because it was an internal EPA memo, and it laid out the ways in which the agency was going to try to undermine the creation of an Office on Environmental Justice. And for me, why should I be surprised? There's been plenty of corrupt politicians, in this country and everywhere else, back to Watergate, back to, Chicago, Tammany Hall, you name the jurisdiction as corruption. But for me, it was pivotal because it was my first experience seeing in black and white, quite literally in print, a memo of, not the most powerful agency in the government, the EPA, but critical, I think, to our livelihoods and our welfare in this country, trying to walk back I would call them relatively benign proposals. This wasn't going to be a big advocacy office within the EPA. This office was going to primarily do research and gather data and make proposals and so forth. So that, for me, was pivotal because it showed me two things at the same time. One, the underbelly of bureaucracy and the extent and lengths to which some might go to undermine things that benefit our society. But also, at the same time, when we got this memo, several of us, students working with faculty and working with nonprofit groups and so forth, activist groups, were preparing a response. And indeed, the memo was in response to things that we were doing to get the office created. And in the long story short, the office got stood up and created, and it revealed to me the way in which a committed team of folks can work together to get out ahead of what I'll call the underbelly of activity, as it were. And it showed to me why that sort of combined effort, and not just an activist-driven one, but scholars, activists working together with a commitment and a purpose can really get some things done. And it's that kind of approach that, I've taken, on both the business side, politically. These things can go together and I think deliver the kind of change that we need.
Great answer. Thank you. Thank you, MK. And Giselle, I think you had a question about what's missing from the current conversation.
Yeah, he answered to that already. I think Kenneth is the one who's left with the last question from the panel.
Kenneth, would you like to ask your question about re-election?
Yeah, it's how would America and the world's energy future look like under another Trump presidency? How about a Biden presidency?
I think it'll be a difference between bad and horrible. Why? I already said that a 2050 target is not enough. That's the best proposal that you've got. I'm happy I'll send it around to the list. I don't know if you all got some of the readings that I shared with you all, but I'll send around the 110 pages that came from the Biden administration. It's clearly a step that's far beyond the current administration, but it's not enough. It's not enough. So the key thing about understanding what it means to be in a democracy is that you can't put all the chips on those that work for the people, the elected officials. Sometimes we forget that. The president works for us. It doesn't always seem that way, particularly with the current one and the corruption and sort of almost totalitarian style, bankrupt administration that it is. But when we really tune into that fact, we see that we as citizens have got to really keep pushing. So we'll get, I think, definitely better behavior from Biden, but that's not going to be enough. A target for 2050, we know, is not enough. If we accept the science, if we accept the way in which this problem is unfolding, that's not enough. And falling short means we put lives at risk, and that's really the big problem.